But before we do any of that, let's go back to the Daily Telegraph. Because the Daily Telegraph, which has done some pretty good work lately, have got a splash this morning in which it says lockdown damage to children was preventable. This has come from the Children's Rights Organisations Alliance, and that includes Save the Children, Just for Kids Laws and the Children's Rights Alliance for England. Now, it's all very well that they're saying that some of this lockdown damage to children was preventable, but let's talk to Molly Kingsley now, who's been on this subject really for as long as I can remember there was a lockdown. She's with Us for Them, and like us, they were talking about this at the time, saying this is preventable, it shouldn't be being done, it's harming our children. Why were these children's organisations not following us in that time? Molly, very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Mike. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I mean, that was the first question I thought of this morning. You know, it's all very well them saying, you know, this shouldn't have been done, it was preventable, you know, they should have taken a different path. Well, where were they 2 years ago?
Yeah, quite 3 years ago now, Mike.
Was it 3? Blimey, I've lost all track of time. I can't remember what I did in those 3 years, to be honest.
I know, and actually it's quite a serious point because, of course, 3 years is a really long period in a child's life.
Yeah.
And, you know, not all of those 3 years, but kids would have been seriously disrupted for good portion of 2 out of the 3 years, in large part because the kinds of organisations that have, you know, great, they've grouped together to release this report as part of the COVID inquiry. And, of course, you know, that's good. But as you say, where were they? Because, as we know, it was left to a cripplingly small number of us, yourself included, Mike, you know, me and my colleagues at Us for Them, very few other journalists and very brave professionals, people like Ellen Townsend, to group together and to try and say in the spring of 2020, when it could have made a difference, this is wrong. We shouldn't be closing schools. We should not be closing down children's lives. And we weren't only ignored, we were vilified. So, you know, it's really bittersweet to see these charities, some of whom we wrote to at the time, begging for help. Right. You know, when we set up Us for Them, we were 3 volunteers. Right. So I'm sounding angry, but I am angry.
Good. No, the reason, listen, we're all angry. The reason we had success at the time with convincing people we were right, in the end we now know we were right, is because we were angry. We still are. Why not?
Well, I think we have a right to be angry because, you know, so many children were let down. I mean, one of the more grim details actually in this report is there are 5 million children now whose speech and language is behind where it should be. That figure has increased dramatically during the pandemic. 5 million. There's only 10 million kids in England. Right. So what? 1/2 of children are now not speaking and communicating as they should be. What does that look like, not only for those children, but for our society 20 years down the line when half our adults missed out on vital speech and language skills?
Exactly. And look at what happened in the university sector as well, because we were told that, you know, the kids who were sort of given a mark for their A-levels because nobody could be bothered to actually examine them properly because they hadn't really been doing any proper schoolwork, they gave them a mark which enabled them to get into university. An awful lot of them are now dropping out of university because they didn't actually really learn enough in the schools, in the A-level curriculum, and they're now struggling to keep up at university level. So they've just gone, we don't know enough stuff, we're leaving.
Yeah, I think this is right. And you know, in truth, the impact across the education system, so from the early years, obviously through schools and universities, has just been dire. And I think one of the aspects of that is this degrading of education. Now, we've heard a lot about it in schools or for the school-age children. And I think we felt actually that there was often to the extent there was focus on kids, it was often disproportionately actually on, odd word to use because kids needed attention and they needed a spotlight on them. But actually the attention such as there was on school-age kids. Right. And actually nursery children and university students who in different ways were just as vulnerable, particularly actually these uni kids, many of whom who had left home for the first time and were plunged into this routine of isolation and remote learning. Of course, they were very vulnerable during that time, and it's no surprise to see so many of them drop out. It's been catastrophic for that cohort of students.
Yeah, absolutely right. And again, you know, one of my kids was kind of going through his secondary school sort of formative years, and as you say, for that sort of up until June of this year, before we went into the sixth form, for the 3 years previous, there had been some form of disruption or other. You know, for more or less an entire year, didn't go to school at all. And it definitely affected him. You know?
I think that's... Well, and I think the other thing here, particularly for the uni students, is it's disruption, but actually we forced their lives onto screens. And I think we're beginning a little bit more to understand the really dire consequences of that, because you can't force children's lives onto screens and expect them to be okay.
Right.
And they're not okay. There's 1 million children now on waiting lists for specialist mental health help.
Yeah.
I mean, that's another appalling statistic. But yeah, we need to be giving a very clear message that schools should not be switching to remote, that university students need to be learning, in halls, in universities, in lectures.
Right.
It actually is a hybrid model. I mean, it may work for the university lecturers, sure as hell isn't working for the students.
No. And we heard the dreaded remote learning phrase once again, didn't we, a couple of weeks back, when the concrete problem suddenly arose out of nowhere and suddenly all sorts of schools were being shut down, even though nobody knew why. And we were kind of going, oh, it's fine, don't worry, we'll just go back to remote learning. And I was going, sorry, don't do that, just don't.
No, just don't. And, I don't think anyone is seriously suggesting here the answer is to have concrete falling on children's heads either. But I agree with you. Why have we brought in remote as an acceptable substitute? It isn't. And, why couldn't we have been using portable? I think in the end they did actually use portable classroom kind of makeshift rooms. But the kids need to be together. They need to be in person. If we've learned one thing from the pandemic, it is that school is essential and not be closed again. Actually, one of the recommendations, credit where credit is due, this report does have some sensible recommendations. I think it's got a couple that are very weak actually as well. The two that I think are sensible is for there to be a senior level children's minister. That is essential. Never should have got rid of that position. We need someone across government departments with responsibility for children. And that person needs to be a senior cabinet minister. And the other thing is we need schools to be designated essential infrastructure, and they need to be almost unclosable. You can all envisage limited situations in which it might be appropriate to close schools for a very short amount of time, but the default needs to be you can't do that, at least with not a supermajority of parliamentarians agreeing it is the right thing to do.
Exactly. But of course the difficulty is that when you dig right into it, and I'm sure you've done all of this, and I'm preaching to the converted, but an awful lot of the schools were given the choice, and many schools did remain open for what they regarded as key workers' children, and they did remain open sometimes quite often. We're talking to Serge Kefai, one of the headmasters of a London school, and he was of the view that, kids, especially vulnerable kids, needed to be in school because they weren't safe at home, practically, And so he had an almost full complement of kids at his school, as many as he could possibly get in there. So, the government were kind of slightly lackadaisical, I think, in kind of not quite taking responsibility. They didn't actually physically shut any schools, but they kind of recommended that the schools should shut. Do you know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. I mean, I think particularly in the first lockdown, the government, although it was cast for legal reasons as a very strongly worded recommendation, I think to all intents and purposes, schools were closed. They were technically open for vulnerable kids. In the first lockdown, only 2% of all children were in school. The government had expected it to be much higher. That number did then improve, but I think for most parents who, weren't key workers, who didn't have vulnerable children, I think when someone suggests, oh, well, schools were open, I think it elicits a very negative reaction, because actually that wasn't the reality for the majority of children or parents.
Right. And of course, since then as well, we've had the problem with the teachers' strikes. I'm not quite sure where we are. I'm so confused about all the people that are striking at the moment. I'm not quite sure whether they're still on strike or occasionally doing some kind of settlement. But, that was another problem, that an awful lot of schools went, well, we're just going to shut the school because we don't know how many teachers are going to go on strike. Don't worry. So it's given them this kind of impetus, if you like, to shut a school, because they've done it before, so we can do it again.
Exactly. And didn't we have schools being shut because there was a heat wave at one point? But I mean, we've opened the floodgates really to this stop-start schooling. And the impact of that on children's motivation. I mean, there was a report, I don't know if you saw out today, from the Education Select Committee. That report says that 22.5% of kids are now persistently absent. That is over 1 in 5 kids.
Huge, isn't it?
It's really, really terrible, actually. And the problem is we haven't got, and this report acknowledges this, there's not a hope in hell of correcting this problem when actually teachers and schools and government are giving this very mixed message about the primacy or otherwise of schooling.
Right. And can I just ask a question about the COVID inquiry while we're here? Because if this report could be produced, published, finished now, why could we not have something from the COVID inquiry who haven't even yet told us when they're going to be talking about children?
No, I know. I mean, and let's not forget that originally the COVID inquiry didn't include the word child in it, which I think says a lot about their priorities.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really abysmal that kids, I mean, I think the earliest now children will be looked at by the inquiry is 2025. I mean, you know, the kids that were in primary school, you know, one of my kids included during the pandemic will be in secondary school. The kids that were in secondary school will have left school. Yeah. It's far, it goes back to what we were saying at the beginning, actually. Children do not have half a decade to mess around with this. They need answers and they need solutions now. And it, you know, that the answers and the solutions, though, Mike, are not going to come from the COVID inquiry. I don't believe that at this point. So I think for those of us campaigning and advocating for children, I think it is a very clear message, you know, get on with it, because you're not going to be able to wait for the COVID inquiry because it's far, far too slow.
Exactly right. Molly, great to talk to you as ever. Thanks very much indeed. Molly Kingsley, co-founder of Us for Them.